So this is one of the first functions for the Lean Construction Institute in Victoria. I have been given 3 or 4 introductory slides from Joanna from the Lean Construction Institute, which I'll go through in a minute. We've really taken advantage of David Philp's visit to Victoria. He's, Steve, I think, been helping with the Victorian government. Sorry, that's all right. Is that something we should all share? So David's been out here for a week and a half. I think you were working for Transport for New South Wales on something that Steve's been assisting with initially. Came up to Brisbane, talked to various people in the government there, and you've been down in Victoria. I think you fly home on Thursday night, is that correct? So when he starts talking, you'll notice that he's got a funny accent, and he'll apologise for that. He's based in Scotland, halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow. So I'll just do these introductory slides. My name's Richard Morwood, by the way. I work for AECOM, although I think I actually work for my wife and kids somewhere. In terms of this evening's presentations, I'm going to talk a little bit about context, what I see in Australia and the UK, because I've been assisting in the UK for a bit, and then hand over to David with the main presentation. Before we start, I would like to thank Tim and Peter for helping with getting people through the door and handing out name tags that are unreadable and organising the catering and stuff like that. So thanks for that. Steve, did you organise the name tags? Is that your? No, that's not your fault. Okay. I found that the ladies' toilets are out that side, out around to the left, and the men's toilets are out around to the. I didn't go in there, but I presume they work. Actually, there is one of the toilets in the men's that is out of order, but it says reliable contracting, so that's not all that reliable, is it? So let's just talk to these first few slides first. That's the program. Lean Construction Institute of Australasia. There's some words up there, but essentially it was born out of 2 organisations. One that was in Western Australia, Lean Construction Institute in Western Australia, which was really supported by Woodside, but was a bunch of people who'd been running programs over there for about 3 years, and the Lean Construction Institute on the East Coast, which was mainly based around Sydney and Brisbane. And we merged those 2 organisations last year. We are a typical industry association. We're a not-for-profit. It's mainly about knowledge sharing and gathering people together who've got a common interest. We have had lots of presentations in Perth and Sydney and Brisbane in particular from all sorts of industry participants, whether it's a bit like this evening around the integration of BIM and Lean and other things. But we've had manufacturers, we've had software providers, we've had international consultancies, all sorts of people presenting to these forums. And there's a website there, and all you have to really remember, it's LCIA, Lean Construction Institute of Australasia, and the org part on that. And we are looking to set up an LCIA Victoria Council at the moment to further what's happening in other states. And if there are people interested in that, either go to the website, talk to Joanna down the bottom there, or come and talk to me after the meeting this evening. So I think that's all the advertising up front. So I'll introduce this, but I'll introduce it by way of context. I wish there was a remote clicker that I could wander around, but I'm stuck here, I think. So look, in reality, I came across all this stuff in 2 ways. I was involved in a lot of alliancing, collaborative contracting. In fact, 3 of us wrote a book, Alliancing a Participant's Guide in 2008, based on experiences primarily in New South Wales and Queensland, but to some extent here as well. Ian Pitcher from our office here was one of the authors of that. And that led me to, I was invited to go and present at the Lean Construction Institute's conference in Washington, DC, around what they were calling integrated project delivery. And so I went to that conference December 2010, and got educated. I sort of wondered what on earth this was all about, and actually found it quite fascinating. There was one presentation in particular from Turner Constructions that really opened my eyes to a different approach to construction and development of projects. And then I got mixed up in some major tenders in the UK because of that, what they call collaborative contracting experience. And and some of those tenders were for Highways Agency, and then I assisted the railway network company, as it is now, with their contracting strategy as well. And in the UK, they had an industry reform program going, which integrated lean with BIM and collaborative contracting. And I found that fascinating. I call that the sweet spot, if you can integrate those particular activities. In the UK, and I think, David, you'll probably refer to this, but there's been a program running, a series of reports up until a set of construction targets issued in this document in 2011-2012, where effectively the Cabinet Office and Treasury said to the delivery agencies, Highways Agency and Thames Water and Scottish Water and Network Rail, if you want to spend our federal money, you have to improve your efficiency. And in fact, in this document, Construction 2025, they set some targets for the overall construction industry that was spending their money effectively. Now, the targets were actually a bit different for some different industries, but they weren't the sort of targets that you could meet by just fiddling around the edges, squeezing your suppliers hard or whatever. They actually wanted to create a situation of industry reform, and hence this sweet spot that I talk about, where it wasn't just about BIM, it wasn't just about lean, it wasn't just about different contractual frameworks and whatever, it was the integration of all of those things. So these are some of the sorts of publications. So they went about this quite seriously in the UK. The Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance has some programs a bit like this, but actually this was a whole of industry reform process that they went through. If you look at this in 1994, there was the introduction of collaborative contracting. 1998, the Egan report, so he was the ex-CEO of Jaguar, introduced lean principles. 2001, modernising construction around performance metrics and benchmarking. 2007, whole of government reform around procurement processes, and then this government construction strategy, which is the foundation of the current reform process. And there are other supporting documents that sit behind all of this. Different forms of contract. At the NEC, 3 forms of contract, if any of you have seen them. NEC just stands for New Engineering Contract, but they're a much more user-friendly, plain English style of contract. These collaborative business relationships under this standard, which is currently being converted into an international standard. And then they're alliancing best practice and infrastructure delivery, which from an Australian perspective is actually quite a weak document. We've taken that method of delivery much further in this country. And I guess to get back to David's primary topic, the BIM mandate also came out of that government construction strategy, where the government will require fully collaborative 3D BIM, effectively level 2 by 2016. In fact, I think the 4th of April this year was the mandate date. During the tendering process, so Highways England, as it's now called, Highways Agency, when this document was produced, actually went on a journey of conditioning all of their suppliers with lean principles, better digital engineering, collaborative type contracts, and in fact insisted that all of their suppliers, whether they're constructors or designers, actually come with them on the journey. And this is part of the story about lean, is about integrating the processes with your suppliers. And in fact, when I was involved in the tendering processes, we had to address this lean maturity assessment toolkit. So how far along the journey are we as a company on this journey with Highways England? Construction companies picked this up. This was one of the companies we were involved with in the UK, Skanska, a large European company. And you probably can't read it, but the government targets are in those coloured boxes there. That's their focus. And in this particular instance, they're talking about modern flying factories, which is a way that they're prefabricating materials for their construction projects or elements of their construction processes in a factory environment close to the work site. Lang O'Rourke set up a major pre-construction facility in the middle of England to do the same sorts of thing. A short history of lean. Some of you will be familiar with this, but essentially it's come out of the Toyota production system. Lots of manufacturing companies utilise these processes now to eliminate waste. They talk about 8 different sorts of wastes. They talk about continuous improvement. Tim who used to work at Holden, was telling me about how you adopted a lot of those processes for the production of the latest Commodore, the VF Commodore. It's an interesting story. So there are lots of books on this sort of lean thinking and the conversion of the Toyota way of the lean thinking into the construction industry. If you want to get a starter book on this stuff, there's a really easy to read, simple book that's free, downloadable from the web by a guy called Paul Akers in the United States, called 2 Second Lean. So if you just Google 2 Second Lean, it's quite an entertaining book with lots of videos attached to it and the rest of it. So in lean construction, we have a number of lean tools that have been developed, some of them in the UK, some of them in the US, and so they're some of the sorts of titles that you see in this space. I'm not going to talk in particular about this contract, although this was a series of 7 contracts set up in Queensland after the floods. Might be quite relevant in New South Wales at the moment. But essentially they were collaborative contracts because we didn't know what the scope of the work actually was. They had to be set up very quickly. They're effectively large program alliances, but that became a very fertile environment for us to try new things. And interestingly, in Sydney at the moment, there's a large program contract called Easing Sydney's Congestion, which is in a similar situation where they're having to define roughly 400 projects around Sydney, valued between 100,000 and 50 million, and they are introducing some of these lean processes out of Highways England into that particular framework. In Australia, there are a number of background reports. The Productivity Commission in 2014 recommended a number of things to do with the infrastructure sector. One of these was around BIM. This is a document produced by the Australian Procurement and Construction Council and ASIF. So this is the procurement leaders from government agencies, and they've looked at the integration of integrated project delivery, which is collaborative contracting or alliancing in different forms, and BIM and what I call 2/3 of the sweet spot in that space. This year's Smart ICT report, also to the federal government, and this has got bipartisan support now. Action on this is pending an election, obviously, but there's some recommendations there as well, although I'm not too sure about the LOD 500 nomination in there. And this is my last slide, but this concept of a BIM mandate is floating to the surface in a lot of government strategy documents, although Queensland being Queensland, they're not contemplating a mandate till 2023 or something, so maybe we can do something a little better than that, given that I come from Queensland. This has got the wrong title on the top, but we did do this presentation a week ago in Queensland, so I guess that's why it's there, although you've changed University of Melbourne down the bottom. You didn't know that. So look, after that bit of a contextual discussion, I'll introduce David. So David, since 2011, I think, has been seconded into the UK government to lead up the work associated with the BIM mandate, so he'll talk a bit about that. He's got a role also in the Scottish Government to lead a similar, much more rapid BIM mandate introduction. And any spare time he does some work for AECOM, and we're very glad to have you here for this couple of weeks. So just to introduce David. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Just to verify, QLD stands for Quality, Lead and Delivery. So it wasn't a case of somebody being lazy to change the slides. So it's a pleasure to be back again in Melbourne. Just setting up. I always think I learn something new every time I come here. This year's been about AFL and chicken parmy. So again, I go back to Scotland a bit richer. So thank you. There we go. But it is a genuine pleasure to be here, and just to talk about, the journey we've been on in terms of the UK, and indeed some of the things that we've seen worldwide. We often use this term BIM, Building Information Modelling. I think it's been about for many, many years in some guise. You go back to the 1960s, and you can still see, the early days of what was BIM, but you had to be over 60, wear a dicky bow and be a man and have a supercomputer to use it. And I think over the years it just became a lot more accessible. And I think we're starting to see it more and more about smart use of data across our built environment. I think it does have many terms and many meanings. I think we often get locked up in it. And I think one of the things we've learned over the years, it should be very much more about the why. What's the purpose of it? Why do it? And I think that's the first question we should always think about, is the why and clear purpose rather than the what it is. And I think that's been one of the key things that we've learned. We're lucky, I've had the honour of travelling, seeing BIM throughout many parts of the world, or digitisation. And we're seeing digitisation happening in many ways. It's manifesting in terms of mandates, such as in the UK, or I'm starting to see more and more in terms of BIM working groups, maybe working through trial projects, and starting to think about how we see the benefits starting to happen. And I think, being a regular visitor across, especially the last 4 years to Australia, starting to see a huge difference in terms of what BIM means. I think it comes in many different guises. It might be digital engineering, it might be BIM, it might be in terms of lean construction, but we're starting to see it moving away from the what and the why to more the how, and how in terms as well, in terms of policy, what does that mean as well? You've seen from Richard all the different initiatives that are going on, and I think we've seen some amazing pockets of excellence, but I think the big question is now, how do you start to turn that into a more effective wrapper? And I think that's one of the things we've done in the UK, is we've given some degree of standardisation of what we're doing, given industry all pulling in that same direction. You can start to see some of the programmes that are starting to happen. So this thing, digitisation, is happening all across the globe, and very much at that national level. But I think one of the big things is not about BIM in isolation. You saw from Richard, in the UK, I think we're very good at promoting, if you like, industry reform. You're probably sick of us all coming across here and talking about it, but you go back to the 1940s, things like the Simon Report. I think we've always recognised these ills within construction. And I think at last we're on that cusp, if you like, of trying to make it that a little bit better, trying to make it a bit more effective and having that bit more productivity. And I think that's what we talk about. This is about reform. I think it's about reform as much in procurement as it is anything in terms of that journey. What do we see it being? Well, is it BIM? To who cares? But I think to some extent we see it about that virtualisation of that asset life cycle modelling. I think that's a key thing as well. I think we often think about BIM as being that part in terms of design and construct. Over the last couple of days, especially today with the Victorian Government, we've talked about what BIM means right through the very beginning in terms of strategic assessment, the digitised briefing of the process, and procurement. And the big prize in terms of operation. I think we all realise that's where the big goal is. So this digitisation is letting us do many things. It's letting us create that virtualisation of the asset. We can test it many times within that sandpit environment. So we start to think at the beginning, the client is becoming learning new outcomes, starting to think about becoming better at defining information requirements, thinking more about how they're going to use the data right through the life cycle, and how they're going to feed it into that digitised procurement process. And actually, you mentioned there, Richard, John Egan. And it was funny, this was actually this term that we called it the 4 Bs, build better before built, actually came with a conversation from Sir John in terms of he was the chairman at Jaguar Land Rover. How can we take the learnings from automation, from automotive, aviation, and start to bring it in? But one of the key things I often think we forget about is that part down the bottom, the operation. Let's not just think about the build period, but let's think about how we're going to use our assets and start to think about the far right. How do we start to think about better outcomes? And I think that's one of the key things we're seeing BIM becoming, not about outputs, but how do we get assets that perform better? And I think that's a key part of what we're seeing. I think also in the UK, it's became more a bit of a metaphor as well. It's become that world starting to think about more innovative ways of doing things. It's starting to challenge the normal as well. And I think we're starting to see things actually changing the way we deliver, and I think that's a big step. So it's not just about digital ways of modelling, but starting to think about complementary ways of delivering things quite differently as well. New forms of contracts, new delivery methods as well, in more immersive environments. You can see that sports stadium up there on the top left. That was a project in terms of, if you like, it was more real parametric. It was about scripting, it was about generative design. So we're seeing much more data-driven solutions. We're also starting to see much more new business models starting to emerge out of this as well. Starting to think about how we trade and exchange data and what that means in the context of a project. I think also, you look back at our programme, 5 years, you kind of look, has it been about technology? Has it been about process? Big parts of it, but number one has been about people. It's been very much, if you like, a programme very much about changing behaviours in terms of doing things, and changing that heuristic bias in terms of actually about trying to challenge the way we've done things over many years. It's certainly changing the culture as well. We're starting to see much more in terms of collaborative working, projects such as this. It's maybe 10 countries working in the same design. So we're thinking more and more about how we can actually share information and the culture that goes alongside that change. So it's changing a lot of many things and thinking more about that delivery excellence around about things as well. And I think, if anything, BIM's helping give us a bit of vision, and I think that's why mandates and such like can be quite effective. They kind of give us an idea of what good can look like. And I like this quote from a colleague over in Milan Polytechnic. But actually, we start to imagine that industry that's got perfect information, perfect data. And I think that's what Lean's about to some extent. Having that good quality information that lets you build and do it right the first time. You're taking that waste out in the model. You've got good levels of productivity within there as well. But we're starting to create those built assets that can actually give the real value that they deserve and want. I think that's a key thing, in the UK. We've had a mandate, and actually we've had these clear milestones. And I think if industry, they can start to see that better place as well. One of the things we're starting to see emerging as well, I think this ties in very much with the Lean theme as well, is starting to think more and more about the environments that we move in as well. Starting to think about this concept of concurrent engineering, or ICE. You can see on the right-hand side over at Stanford University, the Centre for Integrated Faculty Engineering, starting to bring all these multidisciplinaries into the same room, starting to think more and more about real-time refinement of workflows as well. Starting to think about fast technical and fast social integration to reduce time to answer the questions. So much more rapid cycles rather than the world that we often do of coordination, clash detection, let's come back together in 2 weeks' time and find another clash. But it's starting to think more and more about concurrent methods of working as well, and starting to create these good environments. The one in the left-hand side actually is a small practice in London. They started off with 4 people. They're now up to about 20. And they were one of the folk that really actually tracked productivity with BIM. And they're now up to about 20 different people. They used it to de-risk in terms of practice. They were doing things much more effective. And they also started to bring a lot more added value into that practice in terms of what they were doing as well. Suddenly they could take quantities off. They could start to do extra value pieces in terms of risk management. And they've grown quite considerably there as well. So starting to think about a more integrated digital solution. I think that's been really quite key in terms of what we're doing. But also today is about Lean, and for this thing BIM starting to come together and converge. And there's some good papers out there that talks about some of the things it does. And what is BIM in relation to Lean? I think it's probably a component of it. It's a tool that's going to be out there to help basically test things, to start to think about creating that digital sandpit. So I think it's a key component. And I don't think we should ever think of BIM in isolation. Within the UK, you heard from Richard, we had a government construction strategy. It wasn't so much a BIM mandate, but BIM as part of if like a period of reform. It looked at other elements within there as well. Project bank accounts, more modern ways and more collaborative ways of procuring project bank accounts. So were really key and really important within there as well. And I think some of the lean things, we can start to think more and more about virtualization. We can test more rapidly in terms of optioneering, in terms of what we're doing. And we can start to think about more predictive analysis. And again, that was a key thing that came out today, you know, with some of the people we met. Predictive analysis, and not just the building process, but in terms of that project lifecycle, optimization within there as well. And we're starting to see more and more starting to think about automation. And, you know, as the UK continues its journey, we're thinking more about that quasi-automation of things such as procurement, and start to think about checking a regulatory process as well. And I think we see some of the big things in terms of lean coming through collaboration. But I know in terms of UK, we were quite guilty in the early stages of over-collaborating. So again, starting to think about collaboration with real purpose in terms of why we're doing it as well. And I think one of the big things down towards the bottom, you know, pre-BIM, it was taking us often maybe a year to be able to transfer data from capital expenditure into your operational system. So suddenly we could automate the transfer of data seamlessly and allow, if you like, an asset to perform as it should right during these early stages. But again, you know, lean construction and BIM are not dependent upon one another. You know, we can do them both isolation, but bringing them together is hugely important. We see different lean concepts, such as, has anyone used the last planner theory of production control? Richard, put your hand up, go on, make me feel good. Good. See, Richard's heard of it, which is good. But we're starting to see all these constructs coming through in terms of lean together, starting to actually start to think about how we're going to power them as well. We're also seeing a shift towards that centralised data management as well. We start up at the top in terms of real-world data, in terms of geospatial. So we're starting to think about how we can tie geospatial, our asset management systems together, along with this thing on the right-hand side called building information modelling. So we're thinking more and more about relational databases. And we've talked this week about a concept in the UK called infobesity. And we found out very early doors that actually you can have too much information in your geometrical model, and it falls over pretty quickly. Lock the door, Richard, in case the rest of them go. So we start to think about all these databases coming together. So classifications is such like hugely key in terms of what we're doing. So not overloading that geometrical model with too much data has been key. One of the things we're starting to see more and more as well is trying to tie this thing of the tacit knowledge within there as well. I was telling the guys about, we're doing a pilot project in Scotland just now up at our castle, and we've got people that are doing trade skills that, you know, are soon going to be left, you know, retiring, and no apprentices coming in. We've started to create these video films that we can tie into the asset management model so people can start to learn from it. And again, we can do that from maintenance tasks to build tasks and create that virtual register as well. But we're thinking more and more about centralised data management, how we can start to have databases starting to speak to each other. I think the other thing as well, we're starting to see BIM helping reimagine the built environment as well. Our clients, you know, new skills within there as well, skills and knowledge, starting to think more and more about information requirements, and might be in terms of computer queries within there. The designers are changing as well. We mentioned these terms such as generative design, start to think more about scripted process, and starting to think more and more about actually the operational outcomes that they desire as well. And that means they're having to work more closely with end users, with asset managers. We're seeing the rise of the digital contractor, and maybe the contractor's becoming more of an integrator role as well now, that's using more real-time data flows. They're starting to think more about digital quantity takeoff, the computer simulations, and more thinking about, and this has been a key thing in the UK, design for manufacturing assembly. This build off-site, BIM is certainly helping that repetition and enabling that as well. Key to it all, though, is the digital facilities management, our operational providers. And I think for me, that's still times a loss. We still don't see enough of them at conferences. Can I ask how many folk here tonight? Anybody from beyond delivery and operation, facilities management, asset management? Oh, that's one, two. Any rising two? So you should meet up later on and sort of it. But it's such an issue for me. I mean, why is it, you know, academia is not, you know, making asset, you know, management, you know, the course of choice for me. It's one of the things that's so important in terms of what we do. Yet, you know, we get so little representation. I think we've got to really promote asset management. That's been a key thing we've been trying to do in the UK. We've built up many working groups around about it. Because actually, how can we get it right if we can't embed our asset management colleagues right at the very front and start to think about pre- and post-occupancy evaluation and that scenario-based asset management? We're also thinking more and more, and this really excites me, about outcomes. Actually, this world now of serious gaming and how it can start to shape, if you like, our outcomes. You can see there the patient lying in the bed. And this is one of the things in terms of Scotland we're trying to do. When we create new assets, does it actually give you better clinical performance? So we start to use that gamification, actually having the end user actually test the spaces and actually how it operates. So we're starting to see this convergence of all these different ways of working coming together, I think, which is hugely exciting. At the same time, a huge challenge. We're having to bring new skills into industry as well. And I think that's a key thing we've done quite well in the UK. We've worked well with academia. We have a BIM for Academia working group with our universities, college providers. We're creating digital qualifications. And we have this thing called a BIM Learning Outcomes Framework to give consistency approach to training within there. Unfortunately, most of it is still at postgraduate level, but we are getting consistency of, if you like, candidates coming out now that are digital oven ready, if there is such a term. We're also seeing this shift towards this digitised EC paradigm. We call it Industry 4.0. We've talked about it within our business today. But we're seeing this thing called traditional construction being squeezed in two sides. Well, so one side, we see this thing, and Richard's talked about some of the things, the flying factory, advanced manufacture, advanced logistics. And at the other side, we're seeing that world of construction moving into that digital construction economy. We're probably the last industry that's out there that actually trades in that analogue process, especially in terms of commercial transaction. You saw the report that Richard said, that transition to what we've got in the UK to 2025. And as we say, we're moving it towards what we call the fourth industrial cycle, or we call it Industry 4.0. And I think it's a key concept. And back to that first slide of industrial programmes. We had a workshop in Scotland of late, and it was getting all the countries around the world. The Victorian government was represented there with the German working groups. And this concept of Industry 4.0 came out. This new revolution, if you like, where we're starting to see clients who have got huge amounts of data now and starting to new challenges. How do they connect it together? And we're starting to see this world, if you like, where this concept of Industry 4.0 is this world where digital and physical converge. It's been a long day, and how we start to connect things up. It's also a challenge in terms of people and process as well. We're starting to think, as we mentioned, things like automation and that, and how that's going to shape things and hopefully start to reduce waste out the process as well. These are some of the key concepts. So, question, has anybody heard of Industry 4.0? Well, good man. 1, 2. Oh, well done, Steve. That's good. I like to think you've heard it. Richard, just a bit disappointed you've not answered. It's more like the Queen waving there, but that'll do. It's probably came from Germany more than anything. There's been a huge investment within there, especially the big manufacturer companies, Bosch, Siemens, starting to think about interoperability and that connection of cyber physical systems. We're starting to think more and more about how the Internet of Things meets construction, starting to think about sensory networks and telemetry, starting to build data in real time. We also mentioned that word automation. We're seeing it more and more, if you like, in terms of that decentralisation and almost giving our buildings, our assets, opportunity to make their own decisions. Maybe in terms of occupancy level, how does that alter a BMS system? How does it change lighting? We're starting to see it more in terms of real-time capability as well. That data lag that we've had for so many years is starting to go as well. We're moving towards more real-time data transactions, and we're starting to get more and more foresight with predictive analytics. And that's one of the key skill bases that we're starting to come through, that world of basically the STEM subjects, data science, data services as well. And we're starting to see more and more, if you like, new forms of procurement coming around about as well to suit this. And we talk about BIM in the UK, it has been about a procurement reform as much as anything. The last visit to Melbourne was quite a nice one. I was glad to say it was also a bit more sunny. I mean, the last couple of days have been more like a sort of Scottish summertime, which has been hugely disappointing. I was hoping to go back with a tan. And ironically, Scotland's gone for a huge heat wave in the last 2 weeks as well. So thank you, Melbourne. So some of the things, the last time I visited, we're across with the Victorian government and Steve there. Steve, your hand up, wave to everyone. Steve waving. We went down and we were lucky enough to get into some of the garages at the Grand Prix, and we got talking to some of the pit crew, and we got to see some of the technology, and it was actually quite similar analogy to the world of construction. You can see down there at the bottom left, we've got an asset. It just happens to be a car. And we've got speaking to teams to say, actually, how sensor-rich, how much data do these assets have? You can see there's about 2,000 telemetry channels, starting to feed data back to these boxes up here on the right-hand side that start to look at strategy. Strategy for bringing maybe tyre degradation, fuel degradation, things like that sort of thing. It's capturing it almost in real time. So huge amounts of data being collected. But it was also starting to do all, if you like, the crunching. It was running through algorithms within there as well. And we saw there was, I don't know if anybody saw the Grand Prix, there was quite a bad crash. We saw the cars coming in, they plug it in, and they start to think very quickly. It starts to change the systems. It's learned, it's had its, if you like, that post-occupancy evaluation. It's got all the data, it's done all its analytics. And we're starting to think about optimization for that race and indeed beyond. And you look at the size of the data that's coming in from there, gigabytes of data. Well, actually, it's the same in construction. We start to think about real-time capture, Internet of Things. It's huge amounts of data now we're starting to think about. So we are thinking about really much big data in construction, how we process it with analytics, and start to give foresight as well. And it was also a nice sunny day. But you can start to see some of the challenges, what this means in business models as well. So you're talking about collecting performance and operational data, sensor-rich assets, so sensor-rich buildings and infrastructure. It changes business models. Flying across here, most of the engines on the plane aren't capital purchases. They're unitary charge, things like power by the hour. We look in terms of construction. I think we're moving towards more and more construction as a service. So we're starting to think about unitary more than anything. So I think BIM will have its biggest impact when it starts to change the business models in terms of what we're doing. This is a bit of work that I'm involved with just now. I've at Glasgow University over in Scotland. And you can see in terms of the left-hand side there, it kind of shows how we currently, we call it level 2 BIM, how we currently trade. We mentioned it's often historic in nature. It's, it's information that happened yesterday, 2-3 days before. So the further that little circle goes to the left, the bigger the risk there is within there. So what we're trying to do is we move from what we call level 2 BIM, collaborative BIM, to this world of integration, is to get that point of absolute data exchange, well, as close as you can to it. You start doing that, you start to use analytics, we can start to get a probabilistic approach. You can start to look into the future, you can start to think about plan before fail, which has got a huge impact. We can also think about new forms of procurement, because we're pulling in data, if you like, in real time. We can start to think about digital procurement, and we can think about back to some of these contracts that Richard mentioned as well. Do we start to move towards more relational contract, performance-based contract as well? But we're moving to that real reshaping of construction just now. And I think within the next 10 years that we'll have moved fully construction into that whole digital economy. And I think it's a massive change. I think it's the biggest change any of us we've seen in our generation, if not the last 2 generations, within construction. And I bet you £100 will happen in 10 years. So you think about it, mandates have been a good thing, I think, for us. It's kind of helped polarise industry, everybody heading in the same direction. This is the one in the UK. It's actually pretty simple. Government wants to buy data, wants to buy electronically, wants a bit of geometry within there, and by 2016. So government becoming good at buying data on its assets. But you can start to see clear vision, clear milestones along the journey. So we had our Cabinet Office that was thinking about the policy. We also had a Department of Business Innovation and Skills thinking about growth. How do we actually think about tying this into other things, such as design for manufacture, start to actually think about what this means in terms of growth within the UK. We also had on the far right our Construction Industry Council. You can see there their blue agora, the marketplace of bringing everybody together to think about how we bring industry together. And that's a key thing in the UK, that we have to bring all these different institutes and players together. We call them BIM groups. We create huge amounts of communities of practice where people could start to have these forums for discussion, which we'll hopefully do over a few drinks of the vintage champagne that Richard's promised tonight. Richard?
Yes.
Excellent. So we're kind of going through this transition in the UK, in terms of we're moving from analogue to digital. You can see the sort of, and I think this is a good thing, as we mentioned at the beginning, defining the journey, defining actually what it meant. And I think you could do a great job over here in defining digital engineering, but we've moved from that world of, paper, digital ink, unmanaged data, to what we're now calling level 2, parametric, but thinking about very much standards for information management, information delivery, exchange, and all these good things. So we've built a cohesive suite of standards, And we're now starting to think about this world of real-time data and integration. And I think from a lean point of view, that's going to be a huge, huge challenge. But at the same time, we're moving, as I mentioned, from output to outcome. And the big part of this is actually thinking about process, waste and risk. And the further we go to the right, the more we can start to reduce and get that massive prize within there. And it really is such a prize. And we're also seeing as part of that transition as well, you know, that world of clients at last seeing there's as much value in their digital asset as there is in the physical. This is a project just now. It's the biggest civil and infrastructure project in Europe. It's Crossrail. And that project, as they said, will be built at least 4 times. They'll have built it in the model, they'll have coordinated it, they'll have thought in terms of actually the logistical side of it, the buildability aspects. They'll have taken the waste out and probably built in terms of built it before they build it physically with all the waste out. But it's got some key components within there. It's got amazing leadership. They really believe in the digitisation process. It's got the tools. They've really sorted out their information management and their common data environment. Hugely important. And it's an exemplary project. You know, you go to it, and it's more like walking into, if you like, an operating theatre, because they've got the culture right, and the culture supports the whole digitisation as well. I think that's a big thing. So in the UK, we started off thinking about, the cost savings. We had clear targets. What to save between 20% in terms of capex. So this is part of level 2. The first part was the pot on the left, capital expenditure savings. And we're now starting to think about operation. We use the term total expenditure as well. We're moving that out. We're starting to think about operational performance as well. So we're starting to think more and more about the money. You saw from Richard's one, we're moving from the first pot of cash being savings of 15 to 20%, to we're now thinking about whole life cost of 33%. So a big, big prize. And in the UK, we're kind of the same in terms of how you split TOTEX up. And I think it's the same over here. So if we take CapEx and OpEx being 100%, what do we think CapEx is worth as a percentage versus OpEx? Anyone, I guess? Oh, is that somebody brave says something? A third, yes. I don't know. Maybe in the UK we're saying a lot of maybe 20% is the CapEx, but the big, big prize is maybe 80, 2/3 to whatever there. That's the real big prize that we've got to try and attract. And ultimately, we think we'll go beyond that. There'll be things in terms of social outcomes. You can imagine if you actually get a young offenders institute that performs better, less reoffending, you need less of them. And that's got to be our holy grail. A hospital that performs better, so actually you have our better patient recovery, so you actually need, if you like, less bed space. So that was our challenge, save 20% by 2016, drive down capital cost, do it more altruistically in terms of energy and carbon, and actually get assets that perform longer and better as well. So these were if you like, almost like the 3 horses that we're trying to ride at any one time, trying to drive down cost, give added value and do it more altruistically with carbon. And at the same time, one of the big things is about productivity. How do we improve productivity? And I'm sure you've all seen these slides to death to some extent, but actually we looked at the why figure of it. It was often down to poor communication, poor performance management, a lot of contractual misunderstandings, poor quality data, inefficient risk management within there as well. We also saw clients buying their data many times. So you can see there we have in the UK, if like a project lifecycle up at the top. And that sawtooth there, if I can get my digital pointer that you've got in Melbourne. You can see it. It's good to see I'm probably in the most technologically advanced sort of country in the world, which is fantastic. But typically that's how we were buying data. You're buying it, flinging it over the wall, somebody caught a bit of it, somebody else would go through. And when we got to handover, usually we're buying a big package of data there. So it was about trying to buy and grow data right the way through the big green line within there and be able to make more well-informed decisions as well. I just felt glad I could reach it. And that's the journey we went on. It was pretty much almost 4 years of working with industry, putting a task group together, building knowledge and capacity within the client, then building it within the supply chain. We created what we called our BIM 4 groups. And we spent a huge amount of time building standards and processes as well within the UK. We call them our level 2 suite. The key ones are PAS 1192 Part 2. Has anyone actually read any of the UK standards? No? So, it says, any thoughts on them? Good, bad?
The starting point.
Starting point. I would agree. I mean, I think that's where we are. It's a starting point. But they are likely by next year to become the basis of an ISO 19650. So I think that's where we are in the UK. We're not at the end of the journey. We're merely at the start of it. We've got some standards now that help drive consistency within the marketplace, which is a good thing. And as Richard said, you know, we're moving towards 2025 now in this digital strategy as well. But what it's letting us do is create that steady transition, because what we know is industry's got a really long tail. You know, 95% of our industry in the UK is small to medium enterprises, organisations of less than 20 people. You know, we've got to really help them, and we've got to move them along that arrow as well. We have to get the foundations in place as well. Number one for us in the UK was better information management. Hugely important, being able to actually find information that you've already got. Starting to think about strong naming conventions, and starting to think about how we can actually retrieve information at these different trigger points was hugely important for us. And you can see there within that slide, we came better at information delivery up at the top during the capital stages in terms of defining information requirements. What information do we want to support procurement and construction, trying to get index files and data delivery plans. But we also had the end game in mind. We didn't want information that was only going to last for construction. We wanted to make sure it could go into an operational context as well, in terms of BIM, geospatial, and be able to use it for whole life. So that was a huge importance. So was data provenance and validation. So we're now moving into these key aspects as well. Just because folk do things in BIM doesn't mean it's right. So starting to think about how we can validate data became hugely important as well. And I think this is a big part of Lean as well. This is our Ministry of Justice in the UK have created all these digital components. You can see them up there. Before I came across, I was told I had to put the lids on because you guys might try and use it to try and escape from any of these facilities. Tumbleweed. Yep. But, you can start to see it. You know, whether I laughed, and that's the main thing. You can start to see how they've built all these components. So they've tested them. They've got standard prison cells, standard offices, and they keep learning from them as well. And they're all set for design for manufacture. So you can start to see what standardisation is doing. It's driving down waste in terms of the costs. It's speeding up site times. And it's driving up value. So they're starting to get huge value in terms of digitisation of components, standard libraries. It's being more rapid and driving real value through there and increasing quality as well. And that's what kind of their improvement value model looks like. Being able to put out these standard components into the tender, which is obviously means, you know, they're not having to put fee onto it all the time. They're constantly learning from it in terms of post-occupancy evaluation and updating the standards. So constantly taking the waste out of the process as they learn. So feedback loops, hugely important within the process as well. And these are the benefits within the UK. We've tracked, you know, each of the government departments has a monthly review, and you can see there those lines represent a department. So since 2010, we've been monitoring the projects going through, and you can see the savings there from 12% saving to 20% against a benchmark. What I would hasten to add, these are not BIM savings. It's not doing BIM that saves you 12 to 20%. It's how BIM's maybe helped take risk out of the contingency. It's maybe speeded things up in terms of program, which has taken things down. It's better, you know, data for better package of, for better target prices and such like. So it's not just about BIM in isolation, but how BIM enables better things to happen. And you can see some of the benefits that we have realised there, through there. And again, it's about more collaborative outcomes, I think, are key within that point as well. Also within Europe, we've now got an EU BIM working group as well, starting to create some harmonisation across that common European approach. And I think one of the things that I think quite interesting, I thought I had it within there, one of the things within there is actually, if you like, the whole risk pot within Europe in terms of waste is around about 35% across the whole of Europe. So there's a huge prize within there for us still to take and do it. And that's why that groups came together, start to get some commonality, some harmonisation of standards, sharing information. But again, you know, how do we all collectively take that 35% out of the waste process, which I still find quite staggering. And you can see there, you know, that's what we're seeing as part of the group within there. You can see in terms of there's the construction sector, in terms of declining productivity, but also low digitisation as well. How do we move that up the league table as well? And you can see that, you know, it's in terms of a German survey, but we need to move that right up to more high-tech industries as well. And there it is there, 35%. You know, there's the prize in terms of low productivity and waste, coming through misunderstanding of clients' needs, miscommunication, recreation of data, and often no information management. And you've got to think, you know, that's a big, big prize. You look at the value proposition, you know, it makes up in terms of GDP across, you know, average is 9.9% GDP. You know, there's over almost 15 million players in construction across Europe. And interestingly, I mentioned 95% is made up of SMEs, so a huge prize within that marketplace. One of the lessons learned, though, is, you know, focus really much on information requirements within there. We start off in terms of what we call asset information requirements. You know, we work with teams trying to understand the asset management strategy, the data that's required to, you know, inform the organisational requirements. We look at the FM side. We work out the asset information, these pieces of information that's going to support it. And as I mentioned, from a project, the CapEx side, the information, the queries we're going to be looking at. So we pull together this into a client information model. We look at all the data requirements. We put out to tender, and this is what Level 2 is about putting employers' information requirements out. The employer becoming really good at defining what information is required, when it's required, and to what level. We see this term within Australia, level of detail 500 in projects over 50 million. I'll not say what I think about it, but we've moved away from that in the UK. We call it level of definition. We think about both splitting up graphical detail and non-graphical detail within there. So we actually buy information. We might buy less graphical, but lots of non-graphical information. So we'll split that up, and that's a key part of it as well, buying the right of information at the right time. And you can see it there in terms of the context. So we've got, you can see these red diamonds. These are decision points along your plan of work. They support, if you like, queries, so you're going to be asking questions. And you can see there the graph. We then relate the amount of information to that graph. So we're both, you might have, as I mentioned, if you're buying something. So if you go back to, you know, these prison cells, so you might have at the early stages very low graphical information, but quite a high level of non-graphical information within there as well. And you can see there in terms of that level of definition, a project, this is a Crossrail project. The orange bar, the pinkish piece down the bottom, looks at the value of the geometrical information. Geometrical data are really important during concepts. You're looking at optioneering, design development. But at the time you get to construction, the non-graphical detail, maybe in cost, specification, is equally important. By the time you get to commissioning and operate and maintain, the non-graphical information, we're starting to figure out warranty data and such like, testing and emission data, becomes a lot more important. And generally what we're seeing is the time you get into the use case, then it's actually the non-graphical information that's going to inform decisions. So maybe this desk, you know, when's the warranty on it, when's it need maintained, what's the cost of replacing it. So huge value in terms of that non-graphical data. There's an example. You can see there in terms of this was a project for the UK. It was one of our first ones. It was a young offenders institution. And you can see there during that first drop, looking at optioneering and such like, very little graphical information was required. But within that cell, there was a lot of non-graphical information that sat within there, enough to look at functionality of space, to look at environmental conditions. In fact, there was enough information to automate the generation of room data sheets from it. So low level of detail, but a high level of information within that cell at that point in time. We move on to the second drop. You can see in terms of geometrically, that level of detail, the information is starting to grow. And we're also starting to grow the non-graphical information. We're thinking about types and components within there as well. So we're not always growing, if you like, the level of detail and the level of information together, but we can decouple them to suit the questions that you're answering at that point in time. We also use this concept of the asset lifecycle information model. And it's as simple as trying to get everybody into the room, trying to understand how information or data flows right the way through a project lifecycle, especially getting our friends from, you know, the operational and procurement teams into the room. You can see their typical workshop and the typical process map within there. Again, you can see the red decision diamonds. Down the bottom, the boxes that have got our plain language questions. And you can start to see, we can put it together, key decision point, all the different information sources that will be used to answer a question. So a plain language question might be, you know, is it affordable? Does it meet my performance targets within there? And we're pulling out all that information from the model to answer these questions. Richard showed you this slide. You know, this is our next trajectory moving towards this thing, Construction 2025. We mentioned lower costs. We're now thinking about, if you like, whole life costs as opposed to just those early stages. We're also starting to think about faster delivery by 50% as well. And that's in terms of overall time from inception to completion. So not just time on site, but we're starting to think more and more about automation of procurement, automation in regulatory process. And we're starting to think more and more about design for manufacturing and assembly. And I think if you pull all these pieces together, I think that 50% is achievable on some types of building. It's like anything, I think, the word where appropriate, there'll always be, iconic buildings that will still go for a traditional, but something that's maybe got a degree of repetition. I think 50% in a lean sort of paradigm can certainly work in a sector that's becoming more and more technologically advanced. And you can see there, the whole idea of this is, to really, as we move through the targets, to start to think about how we can start to, move to level 3. We're thinking about organisational performance, and we're starting to think about that social performance as well. So the UK has taken very much a whole life approach to it, and it's about early FM engagement. You can see there at the beginning, 80% of those whole life costs are going to be fixed in that first 20% of that early design. So it's hugely important. We call it our soft landings. They've got operational teams involved right at the very beginning. But we're moving to now, in terms of the UK, to this thing called level 3. So we're starting to think about organisational performance, and that's going to be a huge, huge change for us. We're thinking as much about contract conditions and integrated environment as we are anything. So this is the level 3 model. You can see there a toxic triangle. Down the bottom you've got capital delivery, level 2, but we're now starting to think about these two other pieces up at the top in terms of data, from operational activity data and performance data. So we're starting to pull information, as we mentioned, through sensors, through SCADA within there. And we're starting to think more on the right-hand side. You can start to see that dependency analytics. We're starting to think about automated validation. And we're starting to think about upscaling as well. So not just about buildings and infrastructure, but power, water. So we're starting to think more and more heading towards the smart city agenda as well, as we aggregate all these data sets together. Hugely important. And we can start to think more and more about, if you can start to get real-time data, you start to get performance reporting, you can start to think about new, innovative forms of procurement as well. But we're starting to think about these intelligent buildings and infrastructure as well. I think a key component is that Internet of Things within construction. We're starting to already cast in strain gauges and different sensors into, telemetry-rich buildings. So we're starting to think about sensory technologies more and more, the different interface systems, interoperability of huge amounts of systems now. Where the heck do you store it, and how do you do it with safety, exchanges, and new forms of contracts? So it's a whole new avenue we're starting to move into within the UK that's going to take a lot of bright people to think about all these different technology strands, commercial strands, and indeed I think the behavioural strand round about it as well is going to be massive. So you can see our scale going up there. The red line is at the end of level 2. Level 3 moves to integration. We're thinking about one model suddenly, one transparent model. So we can start to think about what that means in terms of commercial. Can it self-check? Can it self-validate itself? Is it secure? Does it start to think about automation of process within there? I think what we're seeing already is, that early days of artificial intelligence starting to move in within there as well. We hear the term in the UK, cognitive asset management, where you can use things such as Watson to be able to run these, natural language queries. And I think the big part, that commercial transaction model in a digital environment as well. So an exciting space that's going to take, I think, a few years to move into as well. But it's taken us, at least in the UK, 5 years to move into the early spaces of level 2, and it'll take, I think, longer to move into that world of level 3. But we've got to get ready for it just now. So industry is starting to embed level 2. We've got to do that mobilisation for this thing called level 3. And as I mentioned, a big part of it is that new in-service performance, the ability to create new, if you like, business models round about it as well, which I think will become hugely important. And these are the sort of things we're seeing emerging. This is an AECOM one. You can start to see the key trends that we're starting to see emerging in the world of construction. So it's not just about data, but it's things such as advanced materials. We're starting to see more and more of that rise of autonomous plant and robotics. You can see that one there. I've had my pointer stick. But you can see these robotics sort of, taking, if you like, the technology from the car factory and bring it out to site, for maybe welding, bricklaying and such like within there. We're seeing more advances in terms of contracts as well. So I'm sure in a couple of years, Richard will have a few more slides within there that will have new forms of contract that the UK has yet promulgated and got it there as well. So I think a really exciting time in terms of this transition that's going to happen at this moment in time. So we've been through a bit of a, if you like, a canter through where we are within the UK, where we're going. I think we're seeing some amazing programmes. I think in terms of what we see within Australia as well, I think you should be proud of the journey that Australia is going on within there. We're seeing amazing excellence, maybe under the guise of digital engineering, but amazing pockets of practice as well. And I think now it's just, how do you bring it all together? How do you start to get some cohesion and bring it all and be able to pull the industry right the way through?
Thank you, David.
Pleasure, Richard.
So I've now heard that presentation 3 times and I'm now starting to understand it.
I'm glad one of us does.
Do we have any questions for David? Yes.
Yeah, hi, Andrew from Philp. I was talking to a consultant last week, and he made a bold statement suggesting that a facilities management model in the UK is worth more than a building.
Oh, it's actually a really good question. I think we are starting to see clients now actually seeing there's equal value in terms of data. Now, it's quite interesting now because we're actually seeing clients that can actually are thinking about reselling some of their data as well. So not just using it for facilities management, but if you've got that standard prototype sort of thing, you can start to, you can sell it to other countries perhaps, sort of thing. Would it be as bold to say that? I think the answer is I don't know the answer to it yet because we're just starting to move into that operational stage just now. We've tested CapEx. We're moving into OpEx stage as well. So I think we'll test that hypothesis at this moment in time. But interestingly enough, speaking to colleagues in America, the General Services Administration, who are well on, I've heard colleagues over there say the same thing, that their data is worth more than their physical estate now. So who knows? Probably in terms of Scottish pound notes would be worth it, but...
Roger Roving, Turner Townsend Think, but also chair of the FMA BIM Task Force in Australia. So many questions to ask, but I'll ask the one that has been the conundrum this week that we in FM have been talking about. So I've literally just run across town from the national conference, the annual conference for Facilities Management Association. And one of the concepts we talked about BIM a fair bit over the last couple of days, is how do you bring in the FM early in the process, particularly if you consider ownership structures. So you're an owner-occupier, government buildings, they're relatively easy. They've got a vested interest in long-term operational efficiency. If you're a developer selling it on, your interest in long-term operational efficiency is very low. That's one sliding scale, if you like, from high to low. The other sliding scale is your FM service, actual underground service delivery structure. So the theoretical model that nobody ever does anymore, where you have everything all in-house and everybody's on your payroll, again, you have a very high level of interest in your long-term FM efficiency because it means you employ less people and you save a lot of money. Versus a 3-year FM total outsource contract where you outsource everything. And basically all the knowledge about how you operate your estate efficiently is sitting with somebody else. Now, I'm going to be the client. I'm going to have a new building built. Where is my knowledge? Who do I bring in if I'm on a totally outsourced model? Because that's the challenge. Who's going to represent me at the early stages, even though I don't know who the actual person is that is going to be looking after the building, and I don't know whether I'm a tenant, an owner-occupier just yet.
I think it's a really good question. So, it's one we came across a lot. Especially, we've got a working group. It's called BIM for Clients that are aimed at private clients, not the public. As you say, they probably develop something and they flip it. They're seeing the value even if they flip the asset within 3 years because actually they know themselves, so they've got a label on it that says actually this asset is optimised, we've got all the data that's going to help you, whoever takes it on board sort of thing. So they're seeing the value in it. But, a key component of BIM is our soft landings. And soft landings requires an operational champion to be involved. As you rightly say, you have no interest in that piece at the time. So what we're seeing more and more is coming to organisations in the UK, it's BIFM and BAFM, and actually getting a proxy partner from an asset management company to come in. Of course, they're never going to get it 100% right, but at least they can help them set it up and look at and give considerations in terms of, you know, performance indicators and such like, and work with the team. So we're seeing a much more reliance now on asset management consultancies coming in and helping shape it in terms of that one. So that's what we're seeing happening. You know, is it right? I don't know, but it seems to be working at this moment in time within there. I think it'd be great.
News for us.
I think it is great news for you. Yeah, I think it's great. And I think what we've got to see, though, is more and more thinking about, you know, those that do have, if you like, you know, that are going to be buying, if you like, facilities managed service, to do it earlier. We hear this early contractor engagement so much. It should be early FM engagement to me. I think that's the key thing. I'd rather we buy sometimes our FM before we buy, you know, our main contracts to some extent.
I think the crux of that is, sorry, is about buying outcomes. And the facilities management industry, again, is something, a theme we talked about today, is about moving away from necessarily managing services, as in how, the quality and how do you deliver the service, as to facilitating an appropriate outcome. And it's a subtle but very substantial change of mindset. And if you can bring that early on in the process, you get to the point is actually we're buying an outcome. So anybody involved in achieving and delivering that outcome needs to be at the table now. So let's go and buy them now.
100%. I mean, that's the big transition that we're on, moving from output to outcome. Still think we're at the early doors of it in terms of our training, but we're definitely on that pathway that's going. But it needs more early FM engagement. It needs universities to be putting more people that are seeing FM as a career right at the beginning of their journey as well, which to me is hugely important.
Can I add to that conversation? Just do you foresee a role of standardisation in respect to FM type of or orientated requirements? The fact that you might have an industry who probably isn't in a position to be able to even articulate their requirements as a first protocol, you know, in trying to understand the data they already have, and whether there's scope to articulate at least a benchmark, a level at which is going to be standard practice for the FM industry as one way to address that. Because I do see the implication trying to incorporate requirements or input from everyone will get complicated where you have circumstances where BIM is being used beyond the construction industry, beyond what traditionally might be envisaged for built environment. So that idea of land administration purposes. Do we use BIM as a way to articulate intellectual property as another example, or e-tourism, which I've seen in academic kind of circles. Disaster management as another example of what's happening, some of the research that's happening at Melbourne Uni.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think we're starting to see, again, you know, I think the term BIM is maybe moving a bit to the left-hand side. We're starting to think about the whole data procurement and how it can be used. And I think we're seeing more focus on data and more data-centric approaches. And what we're seeing is like, you know, trying to think about in terms of information requirements, as you say, beyond the construction. I'll give the example within the UK. All the projects have got to put, if it's a public sector project, into the land and property or EPIM system as well. So we try to make sure at least the data set doesn't have to be, it can be mapped and scripted across to there, sort of thing. So it means you've got all the players from there. So I completely agree. I think it would be hugely beneficial if you've got that sort of vanilla layer. There's going to be some degree of customization, but just trying to give those IDs, I think that'd be hugely beneficial. It might be in terms of end markets or sectors, but I think it'd be great. I know from a fact we've had a go at trying to do it in Scotland with our National Health Service. And it was a long, hard work, but it's hugely worth it. So we now understand all the information requirements for everybody. But you know what? We're all calling it the same thing as well now. You know, from an asset point of view, all these different boards were calling things different names or such like. Suddenly, through workshop process, so we've got the same classification for it. And again, is it going to be 100% right? No, but we've now got a good basis to work towards. So I think it'll take a bit of effort, but I think it'd be hugely valuable.
Yeah, well, I envisage that, you know, cognitive computing might take it another step forward where it's going to be able to articulate, say, a door, not that it's called a door, but because of the context of where it sits and relative to the functionality of what it's meant to represent.
Completely, and I think one of the big things we're starting to see as well, you know, we could probably move it. Semantic web, I think, is hugely important as well. And I think we've got to think about how these things now. I think the products manufacturers are starting to play a big part in this as well, about, you know, how they classify and code their products, and we've got a big move towards that within the UK at this moment in time. But as you said yourself, we're in the start of the journey. You know, it's at the beginning of it. You know, I think it'll be something that'll just keep moving and moving. But as you rightly say, when we start to sort all the unstructured data and start to use cognitive technologies and semantic web, I think it'll be a long way. So I think the university got a huge part to play. Or should I let you pick?
Yeah, no, you've got competition for questions here, but down the front here first.
I have to say I'm a bit disappointed because I came along tonight to try and find out what lean construction is. All I've heard is how wonderful it is. It's sort of, what is it? What do you actually do to do lean construction? I know that BIM.
Okay, yeah.
Separate, but what are the things you actually do?
I'll let Richard answer that one.
Besides it being wonderful.
So I'll try and answer this in 2 minutes, because there's a lot in this topic. In fact, there's a research centre at Berkeley campus of University of California, which focuses on lean construction and its application in different forms of contracting, and Sutter Health in particular is a client in California that's picked it up. Lean construction, if you're doing some research, if you research Sutter Health and the University of California, you would get lots of clues around what they're doing. In the UK, apart from the building industry, the Highways Agency, Highways England, components of what they're doing in their lean implementation plan would give you lots of information, right? There's actually a lot of information around this. But the guts of it is essentially two main things. One is the reduction of different types of wastes. So they typically define 8 different sorts of waste, from anything from excess inventory to motion to the same sorts of categories that are in the Toyota production system. And they'll analyse all of those wastes to check if all of the processes that they're involved in the construction are adding value to the end product, to the end client, maybe to the end facilities manager. And then the other bit is around continuous improvement. So they're continually back-checking on the processes and what they assumed was going to be the performance of that supplier, that process, that element of the construction process, to continually improve what's occurring in that space. So some of those tools that I showed in the slide that described, David mentioned Last Planner, but there's probably 8 or 9 tools that are used in that space, are actually all sitting around either waste reduction or continuous improvement, adding value to the product. Now that's some kind of really headline statements.
What you're talking about is the results of lean, not actually what it is. What do people actually do on the ground when they're doing lean construction?
Yeah, so part of it will be assessing the actual delivery process, so what they're doing in the field to make it more efficient. So it might even come down, for instance, one of the pictures, no, it's not in this presentation, it's in another, but for the Stadium Rail project in Western Australia, which we're currently involved in with Lang O'Rourke, we used the construction scheduling sequencing and the supplier interactions to look at the layouts on the site of where storage areas were, where cranes would be, where trucks would be coming and going, to reduce all of the time frames around all of those activities on the site. So optimising the use of the site for those particular activities. Now, so some of that's related to the digital processes around analysing that, but a lot of it's around the thinking of how they actually develop that project to do it faster, quicker, smarter, and reduce a lot of those wastes.
Still, people do that. I mean, how do you introduce lean processes to a project? What's the process for doing that? Besides just doing your job better.
Richard, I think
Yeah,
there's
sure.
actually an event that we can hold to introduce some of the fundamental lean principles here in Victoria to answer some of those questions. I think a lot of us in the room that might be from some of the industries, whether it be aerospace, automotive, or me personally from building products manufacturing, We've been practicing lean for 20 years. So if we can talk about how you design a process from that initial collaborative contractual stage to be able to get materials and information right the first time, where it's needed, when it's needed, that is the objective. How you go about doing that is by some of the tactics that both David and Richard are talking about, saying, well, how do we look at motion economy from an individual's point of view, or from a site point of view, or from a logistics point of view? How do you identify those wastes and look to eliminate those, either by design or through continuous improvement? So that's a collaborative process. You can apply tools to that, or upfront from design, and that's how BIM is going to help iterate that up front, so that you actually don't introduce those from the first place. You know, you'd rather have waste prevention than waste firefighting, if you will. So there's a lot that can be discussed on that, and that might be a good idea for some future events to introduce some of those principles, lean in action, perhaps, in construction.
I mean, I think that, because I'm an architect, so I'm from construction, so I'm not familiar with manufacturing methods. But I mean, I think it is the problem with BIM at the moment is that we're doing BIM a bit okay. But the whole process is just so badly managed that we're not getting the results out of it.
So I agree. And in fact, the implementation of lean in the construction industry in Australia is at a very early stage. I was thinking of other words, but can we go to the next question? We actually said we'd wrap up in a few minutes, so yeah, just...
Thank you. I'm very interested in integrated project delivery. I've been promoting it for quite a few years, and that we do projects $5–10 million. The architects are very wary of it because they're worried about intellectual property. The owners invariably, they're just interested in what's the cheapest and how can we get out of this the cheapest way. They're not thinking long term of the building, they're thinking very short term construction costs. And when I've talked to the other trades, they don't have that collaborative approach. They've got this design, and it will be often before it gets off the drawing board, the building's obsolete. And then we go forward from there. So there's a lot of clashes, a lot of rework, and a lot of things that they save money at the beginning by not paying the architects enough or not allowing enough in the contract for various things. Then they pay for it during the construction process. So quite often that building is not the best building they could have had, not the best outcome, by not adopting an integrated project delivery process. Like about asset management and that, I often try to get the building managers in at the early stages, the building surveyor, and all the stakeholders, the end users and that. And I've met with a lot of opposition. The industry is not interested. Ken, you're off on another planet. And so how do we transition the industry to adopt this method of thinking and this methodology?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I've been involved, my background is a contractor, so I was involved with IPD forms of contract. And a bit like you, I'm kind of gobsmacked for not seeing more of it across here. It's interesting, I mean, I know in the UK, it's often not the client that determines the procurement strategy, it's often the client's project manager. And I think that there's got to be a bit in terms of, upskilling project managers towards more sort of modern methods of construction in terms of modern contracts as well. I don't know, Richard, can you maybe, obviously that's your background in terms of...
Can I just add something to that? The IPD approach is not considering the end user at the moment. Go and look at the American Institute of Architects guidance on integrated project delivery, and you see a diagram fairly early on that says IPD in the middle, little circle, that says building owner, architect, engineer, builder. There's not, the user doesn't even appear on that, and this is the American Institute of Architects guidance document of integrated project delivery. So what I think is the problem is an upskilling and education requirement of all parts of industry. So that is everybody involved, including the FM industry, because I know from my colleagues from years of working in it, and as reconfirmed the last couple of days, is that we don't understand, as an industry, we don't understand this construction thing. It's just something that happens, and all of a sudden they get handed out a bundle of documents or maybe a digital file, and I'm just being asked to get on with it, kind of. So, and there's a collective learning that needs to happen, I think.
Yeah.
So I'll make one quick comment, and then we'll have one last question up the back. So in my observation, the integrated forms of delivery work better in large contracts where the client is ultimately the owner as well. So typically government departments and things like that. where they're actually seeking an intelligent procurement model which actually enables the integration of parties. I've been in situations like that where the architects have been dragged kicking and screaming into that framework, and once they've been inside it and have seen the benefits in terms of their input throughout the life of a project, they've become advocates for it. So, and I guess the other experience is a personal one. I was the developer for 8 houses on the side of a lake, about a $2.5 million project, and actually set up the first $2.5 million alliance in Australia, and had to simplify it, and it was a very simple document, which was a performance-based contract, and the architect would not participate, but everybody else, engineers, builders, whatever else, and it was just a scary place for them. So I think it's education, it's experience. And it was a small architect. I suspect the big architect that I'd been working on with in other projects probably would have been quite comfortable with it.
And that's the basic building block. Somebody has to build the model in the first place. And usually it's the architect, unless you actually engage a separate contractor to build the model and manage the model and distribute the model. But I'm not too sure. There's a whole lot of documentation issues there. I understand that, contractual issues.
So there's whole conferences built around that legal BIM interface. Can I go to the last question up the back, please?
Yeah, really enjoying the discussion. It's very interesting and great presentation, David. I've got a background myself in FMCG, in continuous improvement, lean supply chain, all that kind of stuff, and I studied civil engineering, so go figure. Well, what's really interesting about this is just you kind of see the interlinkages between obviously like almost supply chain and just industries kind of converging. I wanted to get your thoughts on 3D printing as an application in I suppose digitization of the construction industry, and how you see that as an enabler to stripping out further waste.
It's really good. It's actually something we're seeing more and more. We're having a lot more discussion on that. I think it's fair to say it's about, but we're starting to see that much more industrial level of it. And it's been interesting. We've been speaking to a lot of big plant manufacturers, if you like, that maybe do excavation, they lift things about. And what they're seeing more and more is, well, would it not be quite easy for us to do another application, which is maybe printing of care blogs or such like. So we're starting to see the plant manufacturers taking a real interest now in terms of actually can they, do additive manufacture from there. We're seeing a lot of especially from the concrete side of things as well, starting to move into the space. Now, this is where we talk about some of the other constructs as well. We're starting to see a lot more thought now about advanced materials. And I think as we start to get, come into this space a lot more, especially in terms of concrete reinforcing, we're starting to see that move within there as well. So there's a lot more focus, I say, this year on design for manufacture, and as part of that, we're seeing that much more industrial 3D printing as well coming along. Of course, to make that work, we need to start to think about more degrees of repetition and standardisation of certain components and certain jobs. And I think as that comes there, that it's becoming more economically viable as well. We're starting to see it more and more as well for, just rapid response, in terms of maybe emergency shelters and such like. So it's really starting to get there. And I was at a conference with, it was maybe startup companies that are starting to see it as, something real. I think that the bit that's got interest, the one I see the real interest within the United Kingdom just now is graphene. Everybody sees graphene as being the next big hope of, trying to bring that together with industrial printing as well. But we're seeing a huge spend in terms of research and development for at this moment in time. And we're seeing a few early adopter contractors starting to use it for, various components as well now. So I think it's something we're going to see hugely growing in the next couple of years coming there. To me, it's axiomatic to be able to do something 50% faster that we've got to go down that route.
Thanks, Dave. I was a civil engineer once too. So I'd just like to thank David. I'd like to thank Joanna Gastovich for organising tonight, Tim and Peter for getting us in the door. We might just thank David once again. Thank you.